crush it with Maize-X canola. Maize-X Seeds is 100% focused on Canadian farmers. Your source for high-performance grain, silage, and grazing corn, as well as soybeans and, new for 2026, canola. Visit maizex.com to find your local Maize-X representative.
Let's talk about what's going on in the North American railway market. We're joined right now by Anthony Hatch of ABH Consulting, based out of New York City. Anthony, it's great to chat with you.
It's great. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Shaun.
Okay, so you and I ran into each other at the Tegman Convention, the fall conference that was in Kansas City back in the mid part of August. Really enjoyed your presentation. It was very clear off the top. One, you got a great sense of humor, and two, you know a lot of stuff of what's going on in the railway market. So it's great to be able to chat with you here today. I guess to start off, when you look at the North American rail space, are railways healthy right now? Like, is now a good time to be in the railway business?
So railroads are going through a merger, right? That's dominating the headlines. The biggest story would have been the trade wars that we are propagating here out of Washington. Rails are about 50% trade weighted. And so they're being roiled by that and the merger, which could, totally change the course of a 200-year-old industry. Before that, the story was railroads had really stopped growing in the late teens. Now there was a pandemic, which we're still seeing the impact of inventories and whatnot. There are these trade wars, which, as I've just said, have impacted especially trade with our two biggest trading partners, our two biggest railroad trading partners, Mexico and Canada. So there are all these things. There was the accident that Norfolk Southern had in East Palestine, Ohio, which was in many ways politicized and overstated. Nobody was injured even, but caused a major railroad's main line to be down for a while. There have been weather issues. All this stuff. There were labor issues in Canada at the ports in both of our countries, as well as at the railroads where they went to the last minute to sign their contract last round. So there have been these things that have sort of gotten in the way of normal growth plans. The railroads are all focused on growth. That's new. In the late part of the last decade, they were focused on margin, lowering costs. They realized that they're at the end of that period. So now they're ready for growth, and it hasn't come. So that's frustrating. But if you look at this, from an outsider's perspective, railroad volumes have been pretty flattish, but they handle that just fine. The second quarter earnings, we're about to get to the third quarter, we're fine. That's sort of the story. Despite this headwind and that headwind, they're doing okay. Railroads are very well run. Their service levels after a wobble post-pandemic are back at sort of all-time highs. They generate tremendous cash flow. It's not as exciting as the period of time when they were growing in the rail renaissance period in the aughts and the early teens. They hope to get back to that. One answer may be a merger, where they grow and take back market share from the highway. Those were the really good days. But if these are the bad days, they're not so bad.
Yeah, in the cost cutting period, that was the Hunter Harrison precision railroading, correct? Is that the era we're talking about?
So yes, it started in Canada. He called it scheduled railroading. Then it became precision scheduled railroading, and nobody really could define what it is. And certainly Wall Street misunderstood it. But it's essentially lean manufacturing, moving your assets. If everything runs through schedule, that's great for customers. But it also means that you need to have the right number of people waiting at the intersection to change crews. They don't wait 6 hours and go off service. And you actually can use your assets, and those assets are track, a power, the cars you pull, the people that run them. All that stuff can be used more efficiently. In Canada, it was painful, but essentially created two really, really good service. And for most of the 21st century, the growth leaders in CN and then CP as Hunter moved from one to the other. In the U.S., the implementation as Hunter was getting older and dying, to be honest. He pushed it through at a faster pace than he had because he knew both where we were going to end up because he'd done it before, and he knew he wanted to be there to see it. That caused a lot of friction with labor, with shippers, with regulators and legislators, and PSR became kind of a dirty word. Ultimately, they've become much more efficient machines, and what they wanted to do is what Keith Creel of the CPKC has said is, after some period of focusing internally on our processes, it's time to look externally and re-engage with major stakeholders that we might have shortchanged, like communities, labor, shippers, and then reorient ourselves to growth, to pivot to growth. And I would say the U.S., after a much more bumpy PSR implementation period, was ready to pivot to growth. Literally, if you go back to the January earnings calls that set the stage for the coming year 2020, they all talked about growth. They didn't really talk about margin or operating ratio anymore. Then the pandemic hit in
Yeah.
2 months. And they've basically been reeling back. They've been sort of not controlling their own destiny. They've been a small boat in a raging sea, if in fact, ever since. And they're trying to get back to being in control. PSR is not the opposite of growth. In fact, with the scheduled railroad, you can grow more. When Kansas City Southern undertook it, they said, we're doing that to improve our service. And service begets growth, which the late Pat Onsmeyer famously awkwardly said. And Keith Creel still says we couldn't be doing these things. If we didn't have PSR in our DNA, the merger with KCS wouldn't have worked. We wouldn't be looking at growing here. That's the backbone. That's behind us. But it got sort of bastardized by short-term investors in the U.S. who focused merely on margin improvement.
Yeah.
And it's very easy in a downturn to cut headcount and improve your margin, but you start cutting muscle, not just fat. And I think the railroads have all realized in the last several years that the period of creating value by cost cutting is over. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be efficient. That technology can't play a larger role in the future. It certainly can, things like that. But it means that using purely your cost cutting as the driver to value, those days are behind us. It really needs to be growth. And growth can be accomplished in a variety of ways. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are suggesting it can be provided through mergers. Other railroads are saying that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and precision railroading that became so popular that it was almost like how college football teams try to hire somebody from the Saban tree to run
Right.
their program. Railways were doing anybody that had maybe been in a meeting with Hunter Harrison was getting hired.
So I call it the CN diaspora, right? Anybody who had any, whether you're Canadian or not, because after all, Keith Creel is not, Hunter Harrison was not. But if you'd spent any time there, you could have walked on any other property and gotten a bonus, just if you'd just been through the headquarters in Montreal. There's still CN influence at every Class 1 railroad. You have the
Wow.
chief operating officers of both railroads in the East. You have Ed Harris advising BNSF. Obviously, you have Jim Vena at the Union Pacific. And of course, CN is CN. But the CN is the mothership of all this. I used to think that was almost entirely a good thing because PSR was not as painful. I mean, it was awkward to change strategies and whatnot, but relative to the U.S. experience was a dream and created two really good carriers. And I thought if you weren't Hunter with some of his diplomatic, capabilities were pretty poor. But you learned from him. You were like the band of brothers. You'd gone to Hunter camp. You'd gone through all these, long days, etc. And so you were a band of brothers. What I learned is it's the wrong HBO series. It's more like Game of Thrones. And so you have all these houses out there that, are all preparing for their own red wedding. They basically Hunter created, alpha males. And I say this, they happen to all be or almost entirely be males. And he would put them in a steel cage and like shake it up and see who was able to stagger out. And so you have hyper competitive, hyper personal stuff going on in the industry, but at the same time, you have a core operating competency that they brought. So, the CN story is really the story of the last decade,
Yeah,
even
fascinating.
if it's not been always.
So let's talk about you mentioned the merger. We've got obviously a completion of the CPKC, which created the first kind of North American north-south railway, as some described it. Now we've got the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, which would be an east-west connection.
Yes.
I guess how much room is there for railway mergers if that's going to be the way that to execute a growth strategy, if that's the way to go?
So it's not clear. Most traffic flows east-west. There are two transcontinental systems already in Canada. Um, One of the issues, though, is that there are merger rules that lasted up until 2000 when the BN tried to merge with the CN, and that was rejected. And new rules were imposed that were never tested. They were almost tested when Canadian National made an attempt to interject into the CPKC and try to pick up KCS.
Yep.
The new rules are more complicated. So the question is, a merger east-west would have obvious, although at this point unquantifiable, benefits. It would remove interline. So even if railroads are running well, they're all running very well right now, and you're running 90% on time, and you interact at Chicago or Memphis or Kansas City or somewhere with another railroad that's running really well, running 90% on time, the product is now at 81%, right? Anytime you hand off, you have the ability to, option could be that you fumble that ball,
Yep.
right? That's when a quarterback's take a knee at the end of the game. You have two boards of directors deciding things. There's lots of reasons why single line service and making those interlines just a pit stop, just gas it up, change crews, and go. That can have huge benefits in capacity, speed, and most importantly of all, reliability. There's also, you would save money. You don't need two treasury departments or two heads of grain. You don't need, or you could pick up all this short haul business that's known as the watershed business that was only a couple hundred miles on either side of an interchange. That big railroad work rules, it didn't make sense for them to try. But if you're on both sides, now you're at a medium length of haul. So there's a whole swath of business that they just sort of ceded to the trucks because it was too complicated for them to do it. That wouldn't be the case anymore. So there's all these benefits. They're obvious. The question is, what are the costs to get those benefits that are not yet described? And those costs are that every stakeholder group is going to make a decision once the application is filed, likely in the fourth quarter, sometime before January 29th. And that decision will be support the merger, oppose the merger, or extort from the merger. And so it's oppose, support, extort. And what by extort, I mean that every stakeholder group, that's communities, that's labor, that's other railroads, and that's shippers, are going to go in and saying, because the books are open on a merger, I need access to Houston that I don't have. Keith Creel has talked about that, the CP. So the question ultimately is going to be, you spend this money for the shares of Norfolk Southern. You have to have some unquantifiable amount of money for taking your best and brightest and putting them in the war room for 3 years or 2 years and not doing deals. Then you have a deal that you cut with every one of those stakeholder groups. They've already done a deal with the brakemen and conductors, the largest union, that appears they didn't give much in concessions. Jim Venna, who is the innovator of the year at my RailTrans conference in November, is doing a great job. He's out there, heading off arguments before they start. But there's a lot of stakeholder groups out there. There's the chemical industry, the agribusiness industry, the auto industry, the steel industry, global retail. I mean, all these folks. And what people get confused by here in the States is they think of regulation as being a partisan issue. Democrats are for it, Republicans are against it. And that is not the case in the case of rail regulation, which is really an arbitration of big business interests. So we decide that the White House may support this merger because it's a MAGA thing. Doesn't really apply if you think that, for example, if the chemical industry, which is 10 times bigger, is mostly headquartered in Texas, right? If they oppose it, why would you then try to ram it down their throats? It's not clear, how this will play out yet. How the Independent Surface Transportation Board, not the Department of Justice as every other industry merger, but the STB, how will they decide? What will the other railroads do? They're all watching now, and they're going to come in with their hand out and the knife in the back pocket. And at the end of the day, they'll make their assumptions, and the UPNS will decide it was worth it. I'm going to get so many benefits that this cost, that's a good deal. Or they may walk away. Or the other carriers are going to get their pieces and decide we've got enough pieces for free, right? If they get access into Houston for CPKC, they don't have to give anything up. They're not merging. They just get something.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll decide that's good enough. Or if this deal goes through without much of a hitch, without huge remedies, then you're going to see BNSF join with CSX to counter it and cause two U.S. ones. And then when we get a different White House that doesn't say dumb things like 51st state, well, the Canadians will join the party too.
So this is what I was going to ask, because there's activist pressure, investor pressure at CSX to do something. Is the BN the natural partner, and is CN kind of left on the outside here?
So a couple things about that. It's really strange that these are the same people that tried to disrupt Norfolk Southern. They're very mean-spirited, calling failed CEOs and, sort of tossing out mean words for no reason. It's a level of ungentlemanliness that I've never seen in my career. That's a terrible phrase. But how do you get the target to be a better target. Wear a tighter dress. I mean, what do we, they need somebody else to want to buy them. The Canadians, I think, are out of the picture now, primarily because of the tensions between our two countries. Can you imagine? One of the things that I've learned in my 30 plus years is that Americans tend to love trains. They don't really love railroads. Canadians love railroads. Like CP is part of the fixture of Canada. It
Yeah.
saved British Columbia from being American,
Yeah.
right? CN is a crown corporation. Can you imagine Mark Carney allowing the Canadian Pacific to be headquartered in Jacksonville, Florida?
Right.
I mean, the CN has a rule that the headquarters must stay in Montreal. In the past, they said, well, we'll just keep an office there. That doesn't really get in the way. You think they're going to have a post office box in the current political situation? And you think our White House would allow the headquarters of this to be in Montreal? I mean, these seem silly, but we're in a silly world right now. I think they will get involved if this merger takes place and it's a successful one. They don't end up trading too much to get that benefit package. Then you will see the others have to replicate for reasons. The Canadians aren't directly impacted to any great degree. They're indirectly and over time greatly impacted because you can bundle contracts. You are now a national carrier for the auto industry, so I can move. I can offer rates that not just for this route here. So I think there's a possibility that the Canadians could feel really injured by U.S. transcontinental mergers. BN is just watching, right? Nobody else is going to buy CSX. It's CP already said so. I never thought first of all, they're half the size, right? Second, so I never saw that as a possibility. They're now officially saying that. So BN and all the other roads are just going to watch, and they're going to go to the hearings. They're going to plead. BN has already said this merger doesn't make sense. And ultimately, if the STB decides it does make sense, and we're not going to add a lot of remedies, all these people who are opposing it will then merge. And you can say, but you just opposed mergers, and they'll say, yeah, but you made me do it.
You forced
Right?
our
You
hand.
created
Yeah.
a behemoth here. So we won't know anything until the application is filed, and then 30 days later, the STB accepts the application or not. There are four things in the new rules. I'll just quickly say that never before have we had to satisfy. One is it has to be in the public interest. So that's where you could talk about, as Jim Venna has, taking trucks off the highway. It's axiomatic in the U.S. legislative circles and others that taking trucks off the highway is good. Railroads pay taxes on their network, and highways absorb taxes. They're safer. It's greener. It's more efficient. Even people who oppose rail interests will sort of say, as a matter of course, well, of course we want to take trucks off the highway. That's public interest. The second thing is, unlike past mergers where you had to maintain existing levels of competition, here you must enhance competition. That's not defined. I don't know what that means. I do know that does not mean taking trucks off the highway because the STB does not regulate the highway. That means rail competition. The third thing is you have to prove that the benefits you're talking about can only be achieved by a merger. And here you're going to see tremendous gymnastics by the Union Pacific leadership because they've been espousing their partnership with CN and Ferromex called Falcon, three railroads that run all north-south that run, they say, as fast and as efficiently as the single rail line at CPKC. So now they're going to have to say, well, we didn't really mean that. Clearly, partnerships are more difficult. They involve multiple decision makers as opposed to one. So speed to market, differing levels of commitment, how capital is spent are an issue. But if you could get pretty close to it, if I can get to 80% of the value, is that good enough? Does that mean, do you risk to get to 100%? Do you take the risks of a merger, the implementation risks, et cetera? I don't know the answer. The STB will tell us that answer. And then the last piece is they have to consider the follow-on effects. And that could be all these other mergers I talked about. We could see 6 Class 1s go within 6-7 years to 2. I'm not sure. We could also see there'd be one transcontinental and the others happy with the spoils, or we could see that rejected. But they've got to consider that. But they can't officially consider it because BN and CSX are not merged. They're not applying to be merged. So do you assume they are? I mean, it's an interesting thing. Can Union Pacific and NS satisfy those 4 conditions that have never before been part of a merger process? Will the White House weigh in and try to do what they've done in other areas? They have fired a commissioner, although most people think it wasn't for this reasons. Theoretically, they're not allowed to do that. They're independent, but we've bent a lot of rules in the last 7 months.
Yeah, because that STB board member voted against the CPKC merger, if I remember correctly.
That is right. And that merger was under the old rules. So you've got to figure he's definitely going to vote against. He didn't say it, but the old rules are much easier. These are harder.
Yeah.
But many people in Washington think he was fired as part of a separate effort to clean out people who don't agree with the president's agenda. They actually said that when they fired him. And while I don't take everything they say, I take a lot of salt with their commentary. That one I think might have been right. Most Washington folks think this wasn't merger related. Subsequently, he has talked about the merger, the president, and about meeting with Jim Venna. And he used it once to justify bringing troops into Memphis, and another time, to talk about that. But if the White House thinks it through, and here's another if some of those other industries oppose the merger or want extremely large concessions like open access, why would the White House want to get involved? Because those other industries are bigger, they're just as Republican.
Yeah.
It's not like if you're talking about regulation like environmental and a community does want a pipeline, there is a liberal and conservative, you could see, oh no, we're going to be in the picket line. No, business needs a pipeline. That's what's going to happen. Or drilling for oil in a national park. In a business power relationship between Dow Chemical and Union Pacific, I don't know why anybody in the White House would want to get in the middle of that.
You mentioned, from a historical perspective, the CN BNSF attempt. We've mentioned BN and CSX. Is there any world where a CPKC CN would they ever make that attempt, and would that make any sense at all?
That's a totally different kind of merger, and I don't fully know all the Canadian antitrust rules. That's a parallel merger.
Yeah.
These mergers are to the thing. The idea is you're extending your haul to the like CPKC. They stopped at Kansas City. Now they go all the way to Mexico City, and so there are all these. They could bring long haul corn in there, and there's they serve the auto industry a different way. Those two guys merging, they'd save a lot of costs, but it's a different. My guess is they wouldn't really be allowed. Certainly, in the United States, they'd have no chance, no matter who's president, because that would be, no way that would enhance competition. In effect, you would be taking one competitor out.
Yeah. Okay, good. Just trying to understand the landscape here. This is awesome. And one of the things is here, there's only so much track, and the barrier to entry, once we remove a Schedule 1, the chance that there's going to be a new Schedule 1 at some point, is that at all? That doesn't seem possible, is it?
No, it doesn't seem possible.
Yeah.
Jim Venna has said he's not going to give any concessions. This isn't socialism. It's interesting. He's wrapped himself in the American flag and discussing Lincoln, who put the first transcontinental railroad, our golden spike that linked California to the east. And he's talked about American jobs. He actually disparaged a CN CSX competitive deal because that was growing Canadian jobs. And isn't he from Winnipeg? I mean, he's the fact is he went to the White House. He may have our passport, but as far as I'm concerned, jobs are jobs in North America. Like Canadian jobs, fine. I'm not really sure why that's become a bad thing. He's trying to replicate the patterns of thought of what he thinks will be the decision maker. I'm still on the side that the decision maker will be the very thoughtful members of the STB, who are led by a chairman, Patrick Fuchs, who's incredibly bright. And I think they relish the idea of, opining on the biggest deal in 200 years of railroad history. So, yeah, I'll leave it with that.
Okay. So, from a competitive standpoint, you mentioned roads several times. Are highway tractor trailers, the roads transport, is that the competition for railways?
For the most part, yes. I mean, and they're winning. Railroads have lost share in the last 10 years after gaining share. They were deregulated in 1980, a little later in Canada. But if you look at the first decade of this century, railroads are gaining share back from the highway by running intermodal services, doing really innovative, exciting things. By the end of the last decade, in the 1819 period, that began to taper off. And with the gyrations and labor shortages caused by the pandemic, uh, and the massive amount of truck capacity built to carry Pelotons to your house in Arizona and then carry that Peloton back afterwards. There's too much truck capacity. Railroads have lost share. That is, if you're looking at future growth, it's going to be from the highway. There's business development. There is closer interaction with short lines. There is, the growing economy will all help. But the things that you can really control are highway competition.
Hmm.
And that is the competition for the most part. So, there are rail to rail competitive things, Canadian grain, rail to rail competitive. There are rail to rail competitions that are resolved by where you site the plant. That's business development. We've got a great site. It's going to be here. Could have been on C6. Now it's on Norfolk Southern. But for the most part, when you're talking competition, not to the STB because they don't regulate highways, it's the highway, and the highway's winning. Even cross-border to Mexico, where it's been growing double-digit, 13% year to date, that's a great number by transportation standards. They're still losing share. There's still more trucks coming. So that's both the glasses, half empty, but I view it as half full. There's a lot of opportunity to be gained from the highway.
So you mentioned as we moved out of the cost-cutting era and moving into railways looking for growth, we talked about the mergers and acquisition way to have growth. From a business practice standpoint, what's the next innovation for railways that they're going to be chasing to try to achieve some of that growth?
Well, mergers are potentially growth, because you become more reliable, you become faster. So that's one issue. But putting that aside, it's offering new services, it's tightening your partnerships, it's applications of technology, which are big. They're getting much more data than ever before. Some of the examples that were blocked in the last administration that are now being tested are autonomous track inspection and autonomous car inspection.
Mm.
That seems pretty granular, but to inspect a train, the car inspector has to walk the length of the train, which are often close to 2 miles long, and he's looking at the undercarriage there, a day after the Packers lost and it's raining, and he's very good at his job. But if you send this through a portal with thousands of cameras and AI engineering, you're 80% more accurate, roughly, and you could do it at speed. The train could be running on its regular route, and it'll look at all the cars and see all the defects and see, oh, you need to cut that car out, or at the next stop, take a look. We don't understand what's happening, or whatever it is. The same thing for track inspection. The current process is to run a very slow geometry car 5 miles an hour. So you're taking main line out of service. It's very disruptive. Those two things, which are all about improving safety and but they also improve reliability, and that's a sales effort thing.
Yeah.
So technology, those are just two things. There's a company called Parallel Systems that does an autonomous single container unit that can bring up to 40, about 300 miles. So that's a way potentially that's being tested in Georgia with Genesee and Wyoming. They could potentially go to new, low density markets. That entirely would have been drayed or trucked from the hub, but maybe there's a way to keep it off the highway. So technology, in many cases, there's all sorts of things, and people were blocked for 4 years, and now there's an explosion of people, ex-railroaders. All of the railroad headquarters have lots of people working, in metaphorically in their garage, like the original computer people.
Yeah, agriculture really relies on rail to
100%.
get product to the destination, whether it's domestically or obviously to a port, to Tidewater. Uh, how do the railways view hauling agricultural products? Is it
They
important?
love it.
Yeah, okay. So explain that, because I think a lot of times farmers are like, oh, they prefer to haul energy; it's higher margin, and so just
Well,
talk about
there
that.
was a brief period of time when the Bakken shale was booming, 3 year period. That was very high margin business, because partially because it's hazardous. Now railroads have it's a double-edged sword. Hazardous materials, the government prefers them on railroads because they're so much safer than trucks, and they're actually safer in many ways than pipelines. Lac Mégantic being the awful example that's not always the case, but you get paid more for that, not enough to risk the betting the company that happens if something bad happens. But in the case of BNSF, which ran in North Dakota, they were at some point preferring, because they all this volume came out of North Dakota all at once. and they had capacity for normal business. They had to took a year and a half and spent a lot of money to add capacity. Railroads are pretty flexible in the fullness of time, but not if you have a boom. They can't handle a gusher, right? Because in the middle, they've got to come
Yeah.
in. So farmers are pretty upset about that. Export grain long haul is great margin business. It's from a rail perspective pretty simple. It runs in unit trains. You don't need to make up a train. Origin at the elevator, destination at the port. They love that business. They compete hard for that business. It's always interesting in Canada that's regulated. In the U.S., it is often not. It's one of the few commodities left under SCB purview, but you can take it out of regulation by signing a contract, and most of it is contractual. Um, so they love that business. Now, on the U.S. side, our government, in its wisdom, has helped destroy end markets. For example, our decoupling of China takes our biggest soybean market, handed it over to the Brazilians. They've helped create Brazil as an agriculture. They were a power, now they're a superpower. So there's some worry about where are the end markets for corn and soybeans. But BNSF and UP primarily, where everybody carries grain, but the big ag rail carriers, that is good business for them. And that is, that's why Tegma and NGFA and others will be weighing in on this merger. And it may be one of the commodities where it could help. They supported CPKC because that single line service of Iowa corn to Mexico City was a great business. And it still is. That's our largest U.S. export market now. Now, it was growing and it would have been important, but partially is China's been collapsing. Um, we are so export grain. Railroads can help co-market an export product and say we have, unlike Brazil and other places where they don't have tremendous infrastructure, we can rail this to Portland and get it on a ship to wherever, or we can take it down to the Gulf of Mexico to get it to Europe, and roads are part of the picture, but the demand has to come from elsewhere. They can't create, their derived demand business. If they weren't there to help, you wouldn't even begin to think of selling this export grain. But since they are there, they have to wait for someone to want to buy the grain, and that has to do with government issues and things they can't control. Canadian grain situation, although regulated, which always sort of cracks me up, they're a little bit more in control of their destiny. It's much more of, we have a much larger domestic market. It's a split. I'm talking
Yeah.
about percentages. Um, but even that, because a big portion of that is going to go to um, biofuels and whatnot. And this is not exactly an administration that is going to support that wholeheartedly. So the grain market is really an interesting one. We continually read here in New York and in the States about the depression in the farm economy. Now, input costs have gone up
Yep.
and prices of grain have gone down. We just had Farm Aid, that great Willie Nelson
Yeah.
concert. I've been a couple times. Didn't go this year. I can't remember where it was, but it wasn't in the East. But that led to articles about this. When Farm Aid started, farmers were in real trouble. That the Mellencamp song about blood on the scarecrow. And then we had a pretty good period for a while, and now it's crisis period again. So it's going to be interesting to see. And it's also interesting for me to see that these states continually vote for an administration that does not seem to support their interests.
It is a very, very fascinating time, and yeah, there definitely is a farm profitability issue for sure in the cropping side of the equation, grains and
Yes,
oilseeds.
right. That's what I mean. Railroads love to carry. They've given up on perishables and other refrigerated traffic. They used to have 100% of it. Then highways were built, and that periodically they go back and think there's ways of bringing Idaho potatoes and California vegetables. But when you were talking to me about agribusiness, I was thinking about
Yep,
corn, wheat, and soybeans.
absolutely. Tony, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate. I know you're super busy. You got a lot of stuff going on, and I really appreciate you making time for us. This has been such an
Sure,
enlightening discussion. I hope we can chat again soon.
I would love to.
Hey, now, company is ABH Consulting. If you put out a newsletter too, right?
Yep.
Yeah. If somebody was interested in that, how do they get a hold of you?
I have a website, anthonybhatchconsulting.com, I think. Please tell me that's right. Or at anthonybhatch@gmail.com, and I can tell them all about it. And I'd be happy to do that. And send me a link of this when you're done.
Absolutely, Anthony. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Absolutely. Good to talk to you.